There comes a time when the blankness of future is so extreme, it is such a black wall of nothingness, not even of bad things. It's not like it's a cave full of monsters that you're afraid of entering the future. It is just nothingness. Le néant, as the French would say, the void, the emptiness.
In the late 1990s, Stephen Fry was appearing in a West End play when he went into a terrible depression. One night he sat in his car in the garage on the verge of suicide. In despair and confusion, he left instead on a ferry for France.
I saw these rows of, newspaper headlines and fears for Fry type thing. And I stared at it in complete disbelief. I mean, it was absolutely staggered.
After realising he'd inadvertently prompted an international search for his whereabouts, he returned to London and admitted himself to hospital. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder.
It's horrible to contemplate a futureless future, if that isn't too impossible. And so you just want to step out of it, to step out of the whole race, the whole business. The monstrosity of being alive overwhelms you. Very sort of black stage at the moment, and would love to be somewhere else other than here, frankly. I'm just praying that it'll pass, basically, because it's fucking irritating, and I hate myself for it. I mean, I've never thought that I hear voices, but I do have a voice telling me I'm a complete all the time in my head. Usually when I feel like this, I hide away. I can't this time. For me, that numbing kind of depression comes 3 to 4 times a year and lasts a week to 10 days. Mood to me is like weather. If it's raining, it's no good saying it isn't raining. It is real, That water is actually falling from the sky. It can take you by surprise because it can happen in a sort of crossover, a transitional phase of moods when you're actually quite up. And you can't really make sense of it because it's as if the clouds are coming in, but you feel good. So you think, what's this really weird? Well, what's that about? And it might be 2 days later that it's just got heavier and heavier. The best talking therapy is really listening therapy. It's not talking therapy at all. There's a room which allows you to talk to yourself. Most of the talking is done by the client or patient. And then just occasionally it's the usual thing of, you're sort of saying, I know I shouldn't do it. And they go, why do you say shouldn't? And then you say, well, yeah, no, you're right. Oh, yes, and it's bits of that. The thing that keeps one living is a sense of future, that there will be a tomorrow, and tomorrow I've got to do this, and then the day after I've got to do that. Not that any of these things have a particular logical purpose or a convincing reason to exist, but they somehow keep one going. In the words of Dorothy Parker, a great wit and writer and poet, you might as well live.
Hi, I'm Matt Haig, author of Reasons to Stay Alive, which is now appearing on stage. Reasons to Stay Alive I wrote for myself, really, for my younger self when I was suicidal and 24 years old. What's happened with it is actually a lot of the people who come to Reasons to Stay Alive and read it, they're actually not people in that situation, but they're people who are wanting to understand what depression is like, what anxiety is like, what panic attacks are like, because they're often invisible things. So I think one of the byproducts has been to sort of make this unseen thing a bit more seen, and also to give people hope, not just the people going through it, but their partners, their family members as well. I'd written a blog and people had responded very well to it, and people who were very, very depressed had responded well to it. People who knew people who were very depressed said very, very nice and emotional and intense things. And I thought this is a good thing, talking about it, because mental illness is an illness still, unfortunately, surrounded by stigma. It's not really understood as an illness, it's understood as a personality trait, yet it is most definitely an illness. It's an illness like cancer or arthritis. It's not feeling a bit sad. Again, depression is not an emotion. It is emotional, and it is a disease of thoughts, but it is not in itself an emotion that you can just sort of lift off and get on with your life and watch a bit of TV and forget about it. It's the wrong word as well. Depression is not how it feels. For me, depression, I think of like a flat tire, something punctured or unmoving, but so many of the times depression comes with anxiety, and anxiety is a very, very fast-moving thing. It speeds everything up. It's like adding cocaine to alcohol. It's just intense, and depression I've known is more like an intense sort of inner hurricane. And that's how depression feels to me, and it sort of whisks you away and takes you to somewhere alien and scary. And even if your body and everything looks slow moving, what's going on in your head is very fast and confusing. Yet, that does not have to be a terrible, terrible thing forever, for eternity. It does not have to brand you as a dark cloud person. I am now generally quite a happy, confident person. Yeah, I always know it's there, but I actually think depression has made me a better person, and not only that, I think it has made me more capable of happiness, because I appreciate life more. I appreciate what it is to be sane. I appreciate everything that I used to take for granted about feeling normal and just being able to talk to friends and family. But I also believe that in making me more sensitive and making me thinner skinned, and everything bad that can come from that, it actually makes me feel life more and feel the wonder and the spectacular nature of life. Even in my most recent bout of depression that I had about 3 years ago, I would just sort of leave the house on a night and step outside and look at the stars and the cosmos on a clear July evening, and just stand there and just sort of appreciate and feel deep into my nerve endings the sheer wonder of what it is to be alive.
Welcome to Life and Life Only. We're calling this an uplifting conversation about depression. So obviously there's a little bit of irony built into that title, but I mean it sincerely. We are going to be talking about a few things today, possibly getting the darker stuff out of the way first, and then trying to talk about the lighter side if there is one, and then obviously solutions as well. Anyway, I'm delighted to have back in my podcast universe, because like John Lennon, I consider my work to be one piece, he said pretentiously. And so Simon Weitzman, you were on Glass Onion, and let me just tell you before I introduce you properly that was actually the second most popular episode of Glass Onion out of 85 shows, episode 71. Anyway, how are you? Welcome to Life and Life Only.
I'm very privileged to be back to see if we can smash that with
Excellent.
This podcast. Yeah. I'm taking it that's the one that I was in then.
Yeah, episode 71 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. It was you and Chris Purcell, and we talked about Beatles docs. Yeah,
I think I just made coffee during that. I think you guys talked a lot, and I just made coffee. I'm pretty sure that was me.
I definitely heard you a few times.
I bet that was probably just the gulping, yeah.
Anyway, okay, so what we'll do at the beginning and the end of this conversation, would you like to just talk about your Beatles documentary, first of all? And tell us what stage it's at. And,
what state it's in.
No, what stage?
Oh, right, okay.
Not what stage.
Well, we're ploughing through it. As people will probably know who know the project, it's been going along for about 5 years. And it should have come out a few years ago, but obviously there were circumstances in the world that didn't allow that to happen, both global and personal. And as a result, we are now aiming to have this out at some point in August. We've got it scheduled to be 2 hours long, but given what's going on at the moment with everything on our timeline, it will probably get back a run for its money in terms of how long it is. But it's going fine. We had a bit of a late start. We had the phenomena of the pandemic and the circumstances that now surround us in importing things during Brexit period, which is that we ordered all our equipment to do this edit on, expecting it to come the following week, and it came nearly 3 months later. So having used an Etch-a-Sketch to edit the first sort of 45 minutes together, it sort of started to fall apart, particularly if you tripped up over a curb, had to start all over again. We're getting there. We are getting there. It's a battle because we have so much material to work with, which is brilliant. But it does kind of hopefully inspire me to think that whatever we do with getting this first film out, that hopefully it's the first of many, because there are so many people with such a brilliant voice on there, and how the Beatles have affected them and how it's affected their lives, that, you know, you could really go on, to be honest, Anthony, forever doing it. Sure. And we may well end up doing so if people like the first one.
And this is Here, There and Everywhere, and it's a film about fandom?
Yeah, it is a film about the world, and we'll get to the world as we get round it. But it is a film about not just the world of fans, but the different generations and the cultural sort of shifts in the way that we perceive the Beatles, and people who have been quite close to them in terms of family, people that are just fans like myself who've never met any of them, and people who spend their careers and lives doing something that's Beatle based like you do, and I suppose like I do in certain areas. It's a lovely thing because everyone is on the same level in this documentary. We have people that are quite well known, and we have people, again, like myself, who are pretty much not well known at all. But we're all on the same level, so we all kind of get equal space and equal screen time or audio time. And I think it just paints a very balanced, hopefully a balanced picture of what the world of the fans is. And it's a totally unique family, as you know. There really aren't any other music families like this around the world.
I was going to say, actually, I haven't included the Beatles in my notes for today's show, but, you know, we should probably talk when we get to kind of solutions later on. Or we're a bit biased, of course, because we're rabid Beatles fans, but when I have a shower in the morning, I listen to oldies radio, and every now and again a Beatles song will come on, and I just can't tell you, even after 30 odd years of fandom, how uplifting it is, because on the radio, as you know, you don't know it's coming unless the DJ says, next song is going to be, but they don't. They might say, we've got a Beatles track coming up, and then as soon as it comes on, it's just like your heart gets lifted, doesn't it? And I'm sure people feel like that with other bands, but I think you're right, the Beatles is just this unbelievable global phenomenon, you know?
It's kind of like consistently finding a fiver in your wallet, isn't it? That you didn't expect to be there.
There you go. Never thought about that, yeah. Okay, so our main topic is depression. We're going to broaden it out at some point to bipolarity or manic depression and talk about mental health in general. Now, I'm going to start us off. I'm an English teacher, and so I know the limitations of dictionary definitions when you're talking about abstract nouns, like happiness and depression and sadness and that kind of thing. So it's interesting that I went to an online dictionary and I found two definitions of depression, and between them, they absolutely sum up two levels that we're dealing with. So number one is a state of feeling sad. And then number two is a serious medical condition in which a person feels very sad, hopeless and unimportant, and is often unable to live in a normal way. And it's funny that actually led very nicely into my next point, which is the flippant use of the word depression. So someone's having a bad day and they might say, oh, I feel really depressed. It's almost like the way our culture uses the word starving. When people haven't eaten for 4 hours and they say, oh, I'm starving. It's developed a popular thing which is really watering it down from what it actually is. Anyway, I've rambled a bit, but what do you think about that? Do you think it's used a bit too flippantly nowadays?
We're a first world society, aren't we? So, yes. We talk about how difficult life is right now, and we're doing this podcast in the slightly post-COVID, but not quite post-COVID era, with a major conflict going on that we're on the very edge of in another part of the world. And we're having discussions about how terrible it is that there's no diesel available to fill your car up, and if you can get it, it's like nearly £2 a gallon, or not a gallon, that's old-fashioned, a litre, and how awful that is, and how terrible, and how much it affects us all. And then somebody said to me recently, but we're not sitting in a basement holding our cat or our dog where somebody's trying to bomb the crap out of you and probably killing the rest of your family. So there is a kind of level that you have to kind of get to. So I think we do use it. It's quite interesting, that word starving, isn't it? How we use it. Yeah, you're right. If I haven't raided the biscuit tin for an hour or so. I also have this terrible affliction, to be honest, Anthony, where I have a very sweet tooth, but also quite a savoury tooth as well. And my brain has this terrible problem in the evenings of dancing between, I should have really something sweet to finish the day off, because then it sort of feels like I finished the day, and then I'll end up doing something for another hour or so and think, God, I really need something savoury to take the edge off that sweetness. But yeah, we use these words, you're right, very flippantly. Everyone has a lot of problems. It's the problem of being human. If you're a cat or a dog, it's brilliant. You may live 10, 15 years if you're well looked after, but the biggest problem you have is either being outside or inside, or eating or not eating when something's put down for you, or seeing, if you're a cat, seeing a bird on a tree and just having to sit in the window looking at it half the day. But I think a lot of the things that we construct in our first world, a lot of problems for ourselves that probably don't exist, but they're the ones that, as I'm sure we'll talk about, that wake you up at 4 o'clock in the morning, where your brain is rebooting and the colour wheel is spinning. When you really strip it down, we have very little to worry about in comparison to other people. But the other interesting part of that I found is that when people retire, you know, if they've done a regular job during their lives, then you get this issue where everything becomes quite traumatic and difficult and depressing, or just difficult in general. And the more time you have to analyse that when you're retired, the more microscoped it becomes, the more zoomed in it becomes. You know, I remember having a discussion with somebody who was retired who did a very high-powered job, that the scatter cushion didn't match the sofa. And this was a real problem, because the new scatter cushion was meant to come at 11 o'clock in the morning, and it had gone 11, and the scatter cushion hadn't arrived, and they had other things to do, which was, I think, to go and meet somebody for a coffee. You know, and it all just became really quite, and at that point, you know, I think that's where my depression started, to be honest. I was like, oh my God, actually this is what awaits me at the other end of my life.
Well, let me say a couple of things about that. I think the fact that the phrase first world problem exists is a good thing, because people are realising, you know, and there are memes online. Someone says, oh, you know, third world, I don't even know if we're supposed to use that, but developing world, whatever you want to call it, problem. There's floods, there's earthquakes. First world problem, you know, someone's unfriended me or something. So people have managed to make fun of it, which I think is good. And the other thing of what you're saying is perspective, because it's almost become I don't know at what point something becomes a cliche. People just decide it's a cliche. Oh, think about the starving people on the other side of the world. But it's completely true. You know, I mean, I went to the park earlier, a couple of hours ago, and I was sitting and someone came past in a wheelchair. Someone was pushing someone in a wheelchair. And the person in the wheelchair looked, 25 or something. And I was thinking, you know, I didn't get COVID. I'm not in the Ukraine. I'm not in a wheelchair. I'm in my mid-40s. You know, I'm not in my mid-80s, because my parents are unfortunately approaching. I mean, they're in the mid-70s and very healthy for their age, so they're doing all right. But I think you need someone to tell you, don't you? To say, look, come on, mate. If you are in the first world, yeah, we all have problems. You're absolutely right. And the documentary I'm going to mention later that Stephen Fry made about 2006, there was a woman in that who lived in the first world, but she had it really bad to the point where she couldn't really function. But unfortunately, what happens with words is they develop a sort of popular use, which often deviates very far from their original use. So depression, like I said, the first one I mentioned there, a state of feeling sad. So what I'd like to get onto is the idea of a depressive state versus a diagnosable depression. Is there anything you could tell us about a depressive state? Is there any way you could kind of shake your way out of that? I mean, you or anybody else can shake your way out of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm susceptible to it. The weird thing about it is that I'm not sort of like manic or anything, but I do get into areas where there's a feeling of hopelessness in life. And a really good friend of mine the other day we were talking about something. He's a very successful artist, but we were talking about this situation of imposter syndrome.
Yes.
And I think that is something that creeps up on us, and it seems to creep up on us as we get older. I don't know why. But I could really relate to that, in that I can do things and feel very confident about them without anyone having to give me any particular credit for it. You know, I'm not somebody who has depression because people don't like what I do. That doesn't affect me particularly. But I do have this horrible problem whereby I look around at other people doing things in a sort of a similar area that I do and start to feel, am I worthy of doing any of this? And why are people even listening to me or taking me seriously? And I'm a bit of a charlatan, you know. And that's possibly because on certain things in my trade I have some good technical knowledge, and in others I have much worse technical knowledge. I don't write as prolifically as other people, but I have periods of writing prolifically. The upside of being in a sad or depressive state is, on the one hand, you can have days where you just don't feel like doing anything and everything's an effort, and then the hours seem to roll by really quickly and you just think, oh, I haven't achieved anything today, you know, I've had my biscuit, you know, we talked about that first world problem. Or the other side of it is that, and it's something that I think happens particularly in people that have a sort of creative streak to them, is I actually become pretty productive during my more sad and possibly self-destructive periods.
If I could just interrupt,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but is there a manic element to that, or is that just the down feeling?
The manic element will be what you produce.
Right.
So
okay.
I think I can have a particularly feeling of depression or sadness and hopelessness, but then do 6 paintings and write half a book or edit something together or make a film about something. And bizarrely enough, it will probably be truer to what I want to achieve that would actually make me feel happy. But bizarrely, on that side, I'm better at doing it when I'm in that state than if I'm kind of happy and alive and everything's wonderful. I'm skipping through a meadow of tulips.
That's very interesting. Well, let me ask you though, is there a surge of energy that comes with that?
Yeah, there is a surge of energy.
There may be a manic element slightly. Perhaps?
Yeah. I've seen people who are bipolar, and I've seen people with manic conditions, and I wouldn't say that I'm probably quite on that level, because people that have particularly hypermanic states can be extremely creative, probably far more creative and for a longer sustained time, but it is actually seems to be quite damaging at the same time, whereas there is an element of catharsism about my manic state where I do tend to sort of think, God, this is so hopeless that I've actually done this and it's pretty good.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it?
But I think I wouldn't say that's reserved for people that suffer with a condition of depression or mania of any type. I think there is something in the human psyche that a lot of us seem to go through life wanting to kind of be accepted for something or about themselves, or get some kind of acknowledgement for something they're doing, and feel that if they haven't achieved something by a particular age, perhaps, that they are insignificant. And I think one of the root evils of that, of course, has always been money.
Yes.
You know, we, as a first world society, judge each other by the amount in our bank accounts. And I have worked amongst a group of different people, including some billionaires who, I won't name them, but I would consider to be some of the most loathsome people I've ever met, and who I don't think are particularly human. You know, and I have said to one of them, listen, you can't talk to me like that, and you can't assume that you're better than me. I have just as many zeros in my bank account as you do. I just don't have any numbers in front of it. You know, and essentially, you know, paper, coins, all these plastic now, all these cyber, digital, all these things.
Or just figures on a screen, in fact, because it's not backed by anything now.
It's not backed by anything. And our tendency as a species to judge each other on what we have, what we own, what we've achieved, you know. You think of some of the great authors and artists in life who have produced probably some of their best materials in their later years. You know, we have this attitude in the UK that if you're over 25, you've had it, if you haven't had a major album or something. There's a lot of things I don't like so much about the way in which life happens in America, but one of the things I really do like about America is there is a resistance, particularly in the arts, to ageism. You know, you can be 75, 80 and go on stage or do something or create something, and nobody really mentions or thinks about your age, whereas over here it seems to be we're obsessed with it. You know, I don't get this media obsession with how old everyone is in this country, and it seems to be that we are judged not only by our bank accounts but by the number that's by our age, and that seems to be not only counterproductive, but it feels like it's slightly kind of destructive and demeaning way of describing somebody. It doesn't matter. There's no relevance to a story that you're telling.
Limiting as well.
And it's limiting.
Absolutely. All right. I sent you a few quotes. There was a website that had so many quotes. I'm going to give us a few, and then I'd like you to do the same. So I wish people could understand that the brain is the most important organ of our body. Just because you can't see mental illness like you could see a broken bone doesn't mean it's not as detrimental or devastating to a family or an individual. I'll be mentioning Stephen Fry and That Secret Life of the Manic Depressive quite a bit today, just to warn you. He said the same, that if you think of the mind or the brain as a muscle, and imagine you had what we call in England a gammy leg, you had a permanently gammy leg, he's almost saying that you could have a gammy mind. Those weren't his words, they're my words, by the way. Robin Williams said, I think the saddest people always try their hardest to make people happy because they know what it's like to feel absolutely worthless and they don't want anyone else to feel like that. So you often find people who have maybe prone to depression tend to be helpers or looking out for other people as a kind of an instinct. And then just a couple of quotes from Charles Bukowski, the writer. One of them's wonderfully cynical and the second one is more uplifting. So I don't hate people, I just feel better when they aren't around. And I like this one. You have to die a few times before you can really live. And that's something we're going to get to later. The idea that if you actually have a trouble-free life, it doesn't necessarily do you any good. Because if at some point you do run into trouble, then you might not know how to deal with it. So I guess it's the argument that some, I don't know, darkness in your life or problems or suffering probably might be good for you long term, but obviously only up to a point. Have you got any quotes there you could give us?
I was just going to come back to something really quickly, because the Robin Williams one I think is really resonates with me, because I'm an only child. I don't have children, unfortunately. So I compensate. I say the word compensate, and that sounds really bad, but I try to sort of make a difference to other people's lives by doing the best I can to make their lives better. So I can really identify with that quote very closely, and I think there's so much truth in it. It's a trade-off between trying to make somebody else's life better and actually reflecting slightly in them doing well, which makes you feel better because you've made somebody else's life hopefully a bit better. We just spoke about this before we started, and I quite like this quote. You are allowed to feel messed up and inside out. It doesn't mean you're defective. It just means you're human. And that's a David Mitchell quote, and I really like that. I think that is something that we forget. One of the things that I always think is we buy toys in a box and they're pristine, they're perfect. And then we get them out the box and they're no longer box fresh. I think once we are out the womb, we are no longer box fresh.
Yeah, we've got an expiry date that's coming.
We do then have an expiry date.
Hopefully a long time in the future.
And this is William C. Hannon, who says, sometimes all you can do is lie in bed and hope to fall asleep before you fall apart. That's interesting, because there is a common human thing, which is that our brains reset during the night, and all the ills of the world seem to occur at about 4 o'clock in the morning, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, where we can go to sleep in a reasonable state of mind, or we're just tired. But at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, we will wake up. And it's a very difficult thing to get around, is this kind of feeling of anxiety and hopelessness that you get, where the world just seems to be churning at that time. I did go through a period of these things where I wrote a lot of stuff down a number of years ago, trying to work out why so many things were going on in my head at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And I realised that by about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that I could strike pretty much the entire list as being irrelevant.
That's very interesting, yeah. Something I noticed, is that, well, first of all, I had terrible trouble with insomnia for quite a long time, really. And we're going to talk later about medication and what your views are, so don't tell me now. But I do take a very mild antidepressant, but I think I actually take it because it helps me sleep more than what the other supposed benefits are supposed to be. And that really did transform my life, because insomnia is something I would not wish on anyone, because there was a period of about 2014, which is quite recent, really. I went about 3 months where I used to take chamomile tea, I used to deep breathe, and I used to lie there. I'm only laughing because I think sometimes humour is a good thing.
Hyperventilating.
Well, no, I was just saying to myself, I was always talking to myself, what do I have to do to go to sleep? Like, what do you have to do? I was saying to myself, I could drink a gallon of chamomile tea. I wasn't taking any sleeping pills because I've always had this weird phobia of them, actually. But anyway, just to say, insomnia is a tricky thing. But my relationship with 4 o'clock in the morning is very complicated, because I used to wake up, after 4 or 5 hours sleep and just feel dreadful. But then the weird way, would you say that at that time you ever had really good creative ideas?
Yes.
And then you have to decide, shall I just try and go back to sleep because I know I'm going to feel like crap, and in my case I've got to teach people and be happy and walk into classrooms for 6 bloody hours and not let my standards drop. But then I'm having loads of good ideas. I'm having ideas for teaching. I'm having ideas for songs because I'm a musician. I'm having ideas for stories. I once wrote, only ever done this once. I almost did automatic writing. I've never quite managed to do it, but this was the closest I came. About 4 o'clock in the morning, I wrote a story. And when I went back to sleep and woke up again, I couldn't remember having written it. And it was actually quite good. Yeah, I don't know. So this is jumping ahead, but let's just do it now instead. What do you think is the relationship between, let's say, depressive states or more longer-term depression and creativity? Because there seem to be a disproportionate number of creative people who seem to have these episodes, at least.
I think it's akin to what you were talking about with automatic writing. I don't know if anyone really knows. It's a bit of an unanswered thing. I've read a few things about why creative people seem to be more prone to it. I have a feeling that, as we spoke earlier on, there is a level of imposter syndrome in most people that are creative. They don't really think they're worthy of something. I think Adele is another character in this, somebody who's fabulously successful and obviously brilliant at what they do, who spends their entire life agonising over whether they're worthy of any of it, you know.
Yes.
So I think she's a very prime example, but she's one of millions, you know, of really creative people. Kurt Cobain was another one. Absolutely. Who just totally didn't think he was worthy of anything, was a genius. I'm not saying being creative doesn't lead you to just naturally being a genius or anything, or having these things so you can be creative and not have any of it. But I think one of the processes of getting through a cycle of depression is this natural ability to almost automatically be able to purge it through some kind of creative skill or expression, as you say. There are academics that could probably tell me why I'm sitting there feeling really, really depressed, but writing something really good, or painting something really good, or filming something really good. But I don't know what it is. I don't really understand it. The usual cycle for me is that I will purge myself when I'm in a cycle of feeling low or sad about the world and life, and then when my happiness level raises again, my creativity drops off. And I don't know why that happens, because you sort of feel in the natural world that the happier and more content and more secure you feel, the more you should be able to go out and do things. And I think one of the real good examples of that, or one of the more poignant examples of that, is you look at football players, you know, soccer players. You know, there have been football players and they're earning, you know, hundreds of thousands of pounds a week, and they are playing brilliant football and they're superstars, and yet they will have a drug addiction or a drink addiction or a gambling addiction, or they will be self-harming. And people say, well, I can't understand it. You know, the career's going really, really well and they're earning all this money, you know, and it's all these things that we naturally equate to people being happy that are artificial, total artificial things. And I actually think, from one of the things that during our conversation, is that actually having a moderate level of depression and sadness is actually quite good for us.
Yeah.
If we are predisposed to it, that it is one of the ways that we manage to purge these little pockets of talent out of ourselves, for want of a better word. We're so conditioned to it being wrong, and so conditioned to it being bad and at a weakness. If you have a mental health issue, as we call them, then you're weak, and, you know, and I'm not so sure that's right. I think it's in most of us, and if we embrace it a little bit more, or if we were to remove ourselves from the society that tells us how we should behave during our lives, then maybe we would find it all a lot easier to cope with.
Yeah, I would say that up to a certain point, or if you have dark moments, in a way I would say they enrich your life. Not individually, they don't enrich your life, but the whole point of it, of having highs and lows, is some kind of full life. I would just say that, again, going from this documentary I've been mentioning, there is a woman who has bipolarity up to a level where she just can't do anything. And I mean, I think that's a different thing, but I think up to a point, as I was saying with the creativity, I mean, I still kind of have it now, actually, because I generally have very good days. I've got so many good coping mechanisms, and I've got family around me and stuff. And generally I sleep very well. Like, I sleep at least 7 hours virtually every night. And then occasionally I'll wake up at 5 for no reason. And I won't necessarily be feeling bad, but then the rest of the day will be like, oh, I've had 2 hours sleep less. But then this weird thing happens is that at the end of the day, I kind of think, well, I was actually more productive and a bit more creative. And actually my classes probably went better than normal. But the slight price I had to pay was that I was deprived of about 2 hours sleep. And I felt a bit, it's a weird thing where I felt a bit below par. But then all my activities actually turned out to be better. I can't explain that at all, you know?
Well, do you remember that thing at school when it was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when you used to have a small bottle of milk and you used to put your head on the table and have a think and a little sort of nap for half an hour at school? I mean, not all teachers do that, but... no, I'm joking.
I was going to say, was that sanctioned?
When I was a kid, that was a thing we used to do in the afternoon, But yeah, I mean, one of the really helpful things, I had to do an overnight job for nearly a year because I was trying to help my mum. She had cancer. And I thought, I'll take this overnight job. My work had dried up because of the pandemic, and I took an overnight job. And it meant going to bed, because I was still looking after my mum and also my girlfriend's foster dad, as we called him. I'd finish these things relatively late and then go to bed thinking, oh God, I've only got like 5 hours until I have to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and do this job outside in the freezing cold and rain. And that would be really difficult, because if you get yourself into a place, it's like when you have to get on a plane or go somewhere the next day and you go to bed and you think, oh, I've got to get up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and I can't sleep, and you work yourself into kind of frenzy. One of the really weird sort of self-taught tricks I've done on that is just to say to myself, I'm not going to get a full night's sleep, but I'll have a nap. I'll get a few hours in and I'll feel better, because if I've lain down in the afternoon sometimes to have a nap, then I can get up feeling much better. And I found that generally that sort of cycle of not being able to get to sleep stops when you convince your mind that you're only going to get a couple of hours or an hour.
Ooh, I like that.
Rather than, oh my God, I'm not going to get the 7 or 8 hours I'm meant to have. And you do generally find yourself late for work the next day if you do that. But I found also mentally that you'd wake up, if I was going to bed at 10 and having to get up at 3, normally you'd say, oh God, I've only had 5 hours and I feel like crap, But if you say, well, I'm going to have a nap for a couple of hours, and then you wake up and it's like 10 to 3 and you're like, wow, I nearly got 5 hours sleep. So you're already in this slightly more positive frame of mind when you get up.
That's really interesting. Of course, people didn't used to sleep the night through. They'd sleep, 4 or 5 hours, get up for 2 hours. No one's quite sure why they do this, but I think it's called biphasic sleep. You sleep for 4 hours, get up for an hour or two, and then have another, whatever it is, 2-3 hours. And having a nap in the afternoon is kind of a form of that. You have 4 or 5 hours during the night. If you can catch a nap of, even an hour or two, whatever it is, you do still get your quota. I think maybe we're a bit fixated on lying down and getting 7 hours continuous sleep. I think that might be a bit of a cultural thing. Because in the olden days, when life was less complicated, medieval times, I wouldn't want to go back there, but you know what I mean? In the olden days, before they had less technology, their sleep was perhaps a bit more natural, and people would go in that cycle, yeah. I've had that before, when I've had 5 hours during the night, felt a bit rubbish, powered through a few hours, and then had a nap for an hour in the afternoon, and then felt really good. Because naps are kind of magical, aren't they? I think the Spanish have got it right.
I went to a seminar on narcolepsy. Unfortunately, I didn't get to it because I fell asleep on the train. But
that was a joke, yes. Your delivery is so dry that it's so hard to know.
Yeah, that's been the story of my life. But I think we are conditioned. We're so conditioned in the way that we live, and we're so conditioned to the circumstances that we base what we should be achieving things by. And I do envy people who go through their lives and just their mind is off grid. I think if you can take your mind off grid and not live your life to the expectations of what everyone else thinks you should be doing and how you should be as a person, then you free yourself from it. And it doesn't matter if you have some money or no money, because you're not living by everybody else's standard or your appreciation or lack of appreciation for the way you should be living. You're on a totally different sphere. So I do know a few people that have been able to take their mind off grid and live in a different way. And we do live in this very fast-paced society where everything has to be done like that, And we get very, very angry when the internet doesn't go onto a news page in less than 2 seconds, because it said it would. It said it would do it, and it hasn't. It's taken 4. And, when you look back on when probably you and I were growing up, where we had a tin can or 2 tin cans and a piece of string and pretended they were walkie-talkies. For many years, I didn't have a smartphone. And I had a smartphone, and I found that my anxiety level went through the roof with it. This was when they sort of first came out, and I got rid of it. And I went back to having what people now call a drug dealer's phone, sort of like a very small...
very basic mobile, but
disposable basic phone.
Oh, right, one they can get rid of quickly, just in case.
Yeah, so I had a Nokia something, really small little thing, and the battery on it lasted about 2 weeks, because it didn't do anything apart from make calls and very basic text. And I just found that if I was disconnected from that world, that my life was a lot easier.
Yeah.
And it was only because my parents were getting older and my girlfriend had been ill and I was travelling abroad a lot that I thought, I can't really stand in it. There aren't any payphones to go and phone my folks with, and how would they get hold of me if they needed something? But I think the advent of the smartphone has been a real big part of people's increased anxiety, because the ability to be absolute, as I think I was one of the first people to call people smartphone zombies, and I'm bad at it. We have this absolute addiction of having to look at the screen, having to either affirm that we are upload a picture of our lunch, make sure that the world is still in one piece. As you said, the ghastly, horrendous nightmare of somebody you didn't know at all unfriending you, and what that means to you psychologically. I have nothing against people with smartphones. I have one, but I think they are akin to self-harming in a lot of cases. I used to go filming around the world back in the days where you had a monitor. As a director, I would go around the world looking at a monitor, and I would very rarely see the world with my own eyes at all. It was completely through this thing, and it was like I'd see the world through a TV set. I was working, very fortunate to work on The Lion King, and I spent a year or so before it was being animated filming animals in Africa, and I didn't see any of them. They were all on a monitor. Other people were filming them out of vans and stuff. I was just collating on a monitor. And it just sort of suddenly jumped out at me when I was watching people, as you do, on a train.
Every single person's got, or almost every single person's got a device.
Yeah. And the beauty of looking out the window and seeing the world, actually looking physically at something, and in a train going by. And I'm like gardening, so I like to see what's in everyone's gardens and what they've done, which is difficult when the train's going very quickly. But I do like to have the idea that I put the phone away, and I like to sort of spot who else is not on their phone. It's usually much older people, but even older people now do it. But I do sort of feel that that's a fairly depressing part of, and it's sort of almost a self-destructive part that we have become so... we have this thing, virtual reality, we're going into this meta-universe and all these things, and I don't necessarily think that's a healthy place for a human being to be.
No, not at all. I mean, we don't have to buy into it, of course, but there is a point where even if you don't like to bow to pressure, which I almost make it a badge of honour not to bow to pressure, just to do things because everyone else is, but then you do reach a point where it becomes very difficult not to have a certain technology. And I'll be honest, I pretty much hate my smartphone. I mean, I got it originally, I think I've said this story on the podcast, but I got it originally because when I was in Spain working as an English teacher, there was a point where the school would send alerts to all the teachers saying, we have a new student, and it was first come, first served. And when I didn't have a smartphone, I would check my email. They'd come by email or by text alert. No, I think they were by email, actually, yeah. And I'd get home in the evening not having accessed my email because I didn't have a smartphone. I couldn't be bothered because I wanted to do other stuff during the day. I'd get home and all these jobs had disappeared. So I was forced, I know some people won't believe me, but I was forced to get one. And I think, trying to cut off as many notifications as you can. And I probably only use about 4 apps. I like Google Maps, and I have one for tuning my guitar, but it's not that many other ones. WhatsApp as well. So I think you're right. I mean, I think you could almost call smartphones a boon for the mental health industry. Because
yeah, 100%. And I think, we are predisposed to falling into the trap of it a lot. But maybe that's a generational thing. I mean, we're kind of passengers to all this technology, but the younger people that are born into it, the affirmation or destruction that it causes is artificial in many cases. It doesn't exist. We've just made it exist and we've made it important. But it isn't. In reality, life should be a lot simpler for us, and I think that's why we've talked about your mind going off grid. I've got a really good friend who was very much involved with entertainment industries and stuff, who now builds off-grid houses or dwellings and seem to be far better in their own state of mind than they ever used to be. Because I think we do bring it upon ourselves. It's like we're talking right now in this podcast during, an absolutely appalling conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah.
I had a few days over the last few days where first thing I did when I came down, and I'm a radio person, I'm not a TV person particularly, is put on BBC News, on the computer and have it in the background, just of all this devastation and horror. And there is this horrible guilt. We're not doing enough to help. We're not doing enough all the time, to a point where I am driving myself nuts even listening to this, because at the moment, unless I have to do something like bear arms or take somebody into my home or triage somebody that's been injured because it's come that close, I can't force myself to be totally enveloped by it, because otherwise you do absorb all of that into you, and it's that feeling of hopelessness again, that you can't do enough, or we're not doing enough, or as a society we're not doing. Why has this happened? And there's a quote that I'm going to come back to, which is on the screen here. It takes us slightly back into a different area, but it's actually relevant to all the things I think we've been talking about. And it says, people in therapy are often in therapy to deal with people in their lives who won't go into therapy. We talk about depression and people say, it wasn't like this in my day. It wasn't like this. We went through the world wars. It wouldn't feel like we were, I don't know, I'm doing that accent, but, it was much better and we didn't have we just soldiered on and it was all great. And it wasn't. The reality of it was that it's always been this bad. It's just horrible all the time. It's just that we didn't have it on a smartphone. We didn't have consistent 24 hours.
And sort of this commentary and latest updates, almost as if it's like a football match.
We never had that.
Yeah.
We didn't know about the Titanic for 2 days. But it's always been going on. It's just our exposure to it and the drilling into us of these things. And then you have the other side of this, which is a totally different topic, which is people that go the other way and cope with it all by saying it's all untrue.
Oh, yeah.
And it's all a lie, and we're being manipulated and our minds are being driven to accept all this stuff. And I'm not saying they're always wrong, but I think there is a state of medium in between, which is probably the truth. But it's a them and us conflict, and that's been really unhealthy during the pandemic. It really destroyed a lot of people's mental health. You're either on the side that doesn't believe that there's a pandemic, or you're on the side that does believe there's a pandemic and we should do all these things. And it's like they're two sets of rival gangs. And the media particularly has been very good at baiting both sides. I do listen to a lot of people that have the other opinion of things, and it upsets me and disturbs me. But I do feel that there is a massive amount of manipulation in society to make people divided in this way. And I think that has affected people's mental health more in some ways than the actual pandemic. You were talking about food, and I think that's really relevant to state of mind, and I just wanted to get your thoughts, because you've done a lot of research on diet, and of course one of the things that fuels our mental state is the fuel we put in ourselves.
Yeah, well, this was part of the notes I had on, solutions or things like that. I've kind of... John Lennon style yo-yoed between extreme unhealthiness and extreme health. And, I said I wasn't going to mention the Beatles, but hey, when I was young, John Lennon informed almost everything I did. I just followed everything he did, basically, or tried it at least.
We personally have a very strict diet called macrobiotic, which makes you high as a kite, folks, and no paranoia. The whole diet is based around not eating food with any kind of artificial colouring, chemical or anything in. And until the people who put the chemicals into all our food and water change their minds, or we make it so they have to, the thing is to read everything you eat. Just read every packet and see how much dope they're putting in there. They're talking about drug problem. You want to see what you're eating every morning. Just every packet's full of government-sponsored chemical colouring. Everything's grown with drugs. If you take as much trouble over your food as you do over your clothes, then you can find out where you can buy food that hasn't been touched by chemical. And then it's like having a car and putting the worst kind of petrol in, or trying to run it on sort of Vaseline. It doesn't run too well, and if you really get your machine ticking over with the right food, it really outpaces anything around.
If you actually research food too deeply, you will be utterly horrified by what you find. Basically, in a nutshell, the food you get, basically it's processed food, the stuff you get from Sainsbury's in England, whatever the equivalent would be in America and in other countries. Essentially, everything is pretty much processed. So everything you buy that's in a packet is processed. And what they often contain is things that are called excitotoxins. So if you ask the average person, what do they think of, say, McDonald's or milk chocolate or something like that, they will probably tell you it's highly addictive. There was the guy who ate McDonald's for a month, the Super Size Me, if you remember that. And what he made clear was that there was a physical and mental component. He was throwing up. He felt like he was addicted. His mood went all over the place almost from day one. So these things called excitotoxins, one that people may have heard of is MSG, monosodium glutamate, which is you'll find in a lot of Chinese food, for example. But they're given these benign sounding names, and that's a lot. You find that a lot with marketing in all areas of life. Bad things are given sort of euphemistic names. So excitotoxins like that. And basically the food you buy, which is sort of industrial processed food, is loaded with this. So the more you eat it, it will play havoc with your mood because it's essentially poisonous. And it'll give you a sort of a drug high followed by a crash, but it'll also make you come back for more. And if you ask anyone that's fasted or has eaten only fruit for a few days, what they'll tell you is once you get through the sort of pangs of what I call food anxiety, because we were saying earlier we're using the word starving when we don't really mean it. A lot of hunger is actually food anxiety, and you can actually tell because it actually affects a different part of your body, weirdly enough. So other than getting through those cravings of these addictive preservatives and everything, people who fast or people who tell you they only eat fruit for a few days, they actually say after a while they feel much less hungry. And I got this as well. I was absolutely amazed. I was like, well, I'm eating a lot less and I feel less hungry. And then I listened to a few podcasts and audio books and read some books, and I realised why. I want to put a positive spin on that to say that, diet massively affects mental health. And unfortunately, your average doctor, and I've tussled with a few doctors over the years, they don't really want to know about that. And somebody in my family is a doctor, and he almost certainly isn't going to listen to this purely because he probably doesn't even know I'm doing podcasts. But anyway, I might even change that to a friend, yeah. Let's say someone close to me is a doctor, and they said that in their training they were told nothing about nutrition, basically. It's not part of the doctor's training, but I tell you, it is massive. So if you change your diet, lighten your diet, try and eat more fruit, drink a lot of water, it can have profound effects on your mental health. Let me just put it that way.
Somebody said to me that, if you want to live well, eat the colours of the rainbow, and that's why I exist almost entirely on Haribo.
Ah, yes, you see.
No, I'm joking.
No, but you brought up an interesting point of taking a fact and then, I know you were only joking, but I'm sure a lot of people do this. Taking a fact and working it to what they would like it to be. Exactly. 5 a day, that's all right. I'll have a banana milkshake. That's part of my 5 a day.
Yes, 5 a day. Marzipan fruit, that's the other one, isn't it?
Well, chips contain potatoes, so if you work that around to your logic, that's 5 a day.
But I think you're right. I mean, one of the things that has affected our sort of mental health, or the decline of our mental health over the decades, is portion sizes are just ridiculous. I mean, there's the levels of depression I go to, particularly when I go to America, where, you order something and they bring sort of enough to fill a buffet with. And you're already tired when it comes because you know it's going to be ridiculous.
You're tired at just the idea of digesting it.
The idea, the old sort of adage of meat sweats. That's sort of an element that I sort of feel when these things come. But I'm vegetarian now, and I eat a lot of vegan food and try and stay away from processed foods as much as I can. Though I am in a long-term relationship, I live on my own, so I am still susceptible to the Pringles and chocolate days that I think most middle-aged single men have, and trying to convince myself that I didn't have anything else. But I have to say, my grandfather had a series of massive heart attacks, and after one of them, and he must have been in his 60s at this point, decided that he just basically said bollocks to all of it, He tried to eat all the right things, and he just decided all the things that he really liked were custard, chips, chocolate, and bananas. And bizarrely enough, the last sort of decade of his life, that's what he existed on. And he actually lived very well, and it wasn't so much to do with what he was putting into himself, it's how he felt about the fact that he had this. I think if you've had a brush with death, as it were, then it was kind of like, well, I don't know which day's going to be my last, so if I want chips and chocolate and bananas, but I mean, obviously that was just an example of somebody whose mind works in a particular way. You're absolutely right, though. We do have to look at what we're putting in ourselves, and processed foods have so many, as you said, appalling things in it that we don't realise how much that changes our state of mind. And we sometimes look at people in countries, in situations, and they're less fortunate than we are, a lot less fortunate than we are, but they seem to be sort of bizarrely healthier than us, and it's because they don't eat all this crap that we do. They eat much better food, or they make food properly. But again, that comes down to our way of life here. On the continent, it always amazed me when I was married, going over to France, and you'd have 2 hours off for lunch, and you'd sit and have a proper lunch. Proper bread with proper butter and proper food that was made from a market or local produce.
Eaten slowly, I suppose, as well.
And you'd eat it slowly, and you'd talk, and you'd have this kind of slower pace of life. And the UK is just awful at this kind of like, you can't stop for lunch, you just stuff it in, while you're running. If you could inject it into yourself, you would. So I think there is a state and a quality and a way of life that we're so, we're beaten over the head we have to be like here, and the truth is we don't.
Yeah, just going back to media, we won't talk about Ukraine now, but just to say that mainstream media, as they call it, BBC and everything, does kind of feed this fear thing. They do kind of stoke it up, and it's done in a very sort of respectable, polished way. I actually get a lot of news from podcasters, and I temper it. I completely agree with you that there are people who tell you that everything's fake, and I've actually done a couple of episodes about the phrase conspiracy theory and making the argument that there are those people around, but then stuff that's not on the news is often dismissed as conspiracy theory, when in fact some of it does actually turn out to be true anyway.
Fake news is used by both sides of the argument, so nobody knows what the truth is at all, and it seems to have been constructed to create a war of sorts between people, which is totally unhealthy.
I'm really pleased you said that, because I don't want my listeners who've maybe listened to previous episodes to think that I am one of those people who thinks that everything's fake. But I think you're right. There's fakeness on both sides, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. And where it is in the middle, because the middle is a big place. If you take two extremes and everything else is in the middle, where the hell is it on that continuum? Who knows? But
well, you're right. You've used the word extreme.
Yeah.
And that's as a society what's happening to us, is we're being pushed into these extreme edges of it. And in the middle, there is a really delicious, very well-made apple pie that everyone could eat and be happy with, but we're being magnetically drawn back from it.
That's an apple pie with fresh apples, everybody. She wasn't telling you an apple pie loaded with excitotoxins, everybody.
Yeah. Although I must say that if I do get back into music and have another band, I will call it the Excitotoxins.
Ah, nice. Yes.
It's a fantastic name for a band.
I could give you some of those euphemistic names if I find them as well.
The different albums.
Yeah, but they're not as catchy as Excitotoxins. Yeah. I'm going to ask you about Professor Green in a second, but for that, I'm just going to... I always like to recommend things, and I'm going to recommend a book called Reasons to Stay Alive by Matt Haig. That's Haig. I read this book probably about 5 or 6 years ago, and I haven't read it again, but I think I'm going to, actually. It's a very easy-to-read book. He did another book called The Humans, a novel, which I loved, which, if you want to see how balmy our society is, that's a good way, good place to go. But I wanted to read just a few paragraphs, called In Praise of Thin Skins. Here we go. I have a thin skin. I think this is part and parcel of depression and anxiety, or to be precise, being a person quite likely to get depression and anxiety. I also think that I'll never fully get over my breakdown 14 years ago. If the stone falls hard enough, the ripples last a lifetime. I've gone from never feeling happy to feeling happy, or at least somewhere in the ballpark, most of the time. So I'm lucky, but I have blips. Either blips when I'm genuinely depressed and anxious, or blips caused by me fighting the onset of depression and anxiety by doing something stupid like getting excessively drunk, coming home at 5 in the morning after losing my wallet and having to plead with taxi drivers to take me home. Told you he used humour, which I appreciate. Generally, day to day, I don't fight it. I accept things more. This is who I am. The trick is to befriend depression and anxiety, to be thankful for them, because then you can deal with them a whole lot better. And the way I've befriended them is by thanking them for my thin skin. Sure, without a thin skin I would never have known those terrible days of nothingness, those days of either panic or intense bone-scorching lethargy, the days of self-hate or drowning under invisible waves. But would I go along to a magical mind spa and ask for a skin-thickening treatment? Probably not. You need to feel life's terror to feel its wonder. And I feel it today, actually, right now, in what could seem like quite a grey, overcast afternoon. I feel the sheer, unfathomable marvel that is this strange life we have here on Earth, the 7 billion of us clustered in our towns and cities on this pale blue dot of a planet, spending our allotted 30,000 days as best we can in glorious insignificance. I like to feel the force of that miracle. I like to burrow deep into this life and explore it through the magic of words and the magic of human beings. And I'm glad to feel every tumultuous second of it, and glad for the fact that when I walk into the vast room with all the Tintorettos in it in the National Gallery, my skin literally tingles and my heart palpitates, and I'm glad for the synesthesia that means when I read Emily Dickinson or Mark Twain, my mind feels actual warmth for those old American words. Feeling. That is what it's all about.
Yeah, it's a lovely piece, that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a great book, Reasons to Stay Alive by Matt Haig. And in this Stephen Fry documentary, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but at the end they say, and this is bipolarity rather than just depression, they say if you could press a button and get rid of it with all its foibles, would you press that button? And there was one lady who, like I said, had a very, very severe, completely dysfunctional form of it, and she said, I would press a button. But every other person, including Stephen Fry, said, no way. Because after a while they realised that's kind of who they were and that there was a richness to it. And again, if there's anyone listening who has a very, very severe case of it, you might not want to take what I say at face value, because I haven't had that myself. But up to a certain level, there's a richness in it. I think you mentioned that earlier.
When I first met my girlfriend, she told me she was bi. And I thought this is going to be really exciting and wonderful. But it turns out she meant bipolar.
And that's true, is it?
Sort of.
We'll leave it there.
Not really. No, I think one of the things that the recommendations that you're making are all excellent. There's a book by a guy called Matthew Johnson called I Had a Black Dog, which is another kind of way of looking at things, and it's actually quite an enlightening book, and it's beautifully written, and that's been very helpful. We talked about Professor Green, aka Stephen Manderson, who talks about suicide, anxiety and depression, and he's just brilliant. He's so honest about it all. But the way he speaks and the way he conducts himself and the way he translates it, perhaps to a younger generation than mine, is so in tune with accepting that these things can happen and how to deal with them. And I think if the younger people find themselves in a situation where they are feeling anxious or depressed or suicidal, then, go on to the mighty internet, which we've been talking about avoiding, and take yourself to YouTube and just put in Professor Green on suicide, anxiety and depression. You will find half a dozen to a dozen really excellent talks and pieces that he's done on it. I think he's an extraordinary person, apart from being a brilliant lyricist. I think he's so well connected with the whole psyche of what it is to deal with it, that you come out of it feeling quite positive, because he is very upbeat in the way that he does it. He's extremely honest at the same time. So there's that, and there's a book that I think a lot of people have got by Charlie Mackesy, which is called The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse. It's a beautifully illustrated and handwritten book. And I've bought it for a few people that have dealt with. My mum's been dealing with cancer, and obviously we lost my dad a couple of years ago, so we've been dealing with all of that. And I bought her this book, and it's been incredibly helpful, because the one thing it actually taught her from reading through it is that it's not a weakness to ask for help. And I think that's one of the things that people who suffer with depression and anxiety are always very loath to do, is admit it and ask for help. So my mum's found that enormously helpful, because my mum comes from a very working class family. You know, you never ask for help, you just get through life. And I think the fact that she has empowered herself to ask other people for help has been a real freedom and revelation for her to get through stress, anxiety, depression of loss and illness. So I think that's really interesting. And the power of comedy is huge.
Oh yes, let's talk about that.
As the antichrist, as it were, to the wonderful book that is The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse, is another book which I actually refer to quite a lot, which is actually called The Panda, the Cat and the Dreadful Teddy. And it is a parody on that wonderful book, and it's by a guy called Paul Magrs, M-A-G-R-S. I love this book because it just pulls it to pieces, but it's so funny and so witty that you can't help but feel cheered up by it. Comedy is an enormous, I wouldn't say cure, but it's an enormous help. So if you go to bed and you're watching something pretty heavy or depressing or hard, then it will sit and play on your mind. And if you have earlier on in the evening sat through something that has those kind of elements to it, I really recommend that you do, even if you go on to like Dave or something and just watch an old episode of Mock the Week or Have I Got News for You, or, you know, if you're in the US and you get a chance to watch Curb Your Enthusiasm, or any of these things which are just brilliant. Something that makes you feel, that makes you laugh and makes you smile. It's such a good tonic for things. And
it is.
So I think, you know, if you can and you have the ability to look through things in the evening, try not to fall down if you are prone to kind of falling down the road of, you know, looking into news in some depth and then going into very stark corridors of it, pull back from that and just accept the fact that you aren't going to change the world. And actually one of the things that we can do, which is uniquely human, apart from singing, which is another thing, music's a uniquely human thing, is laughter, which is uniquely human. I mean, there are some monkeys that can laugh, but it is generally uniquely human. The power of comedy is just extraordinary. So I have one last thing, if I may,
go on.
Anthony, which is that one of my grandfather's best friends was Spike Milligan, who suffered, of course, from manic depression and anxiety, all sorts of issues, and was institutionalised numerous times for it, but was a genius and funny at the same time. And I wrote, when I was younger, something called Howard and a Small Piece of Red with a group of friends, and the idea of this exercise, we would write something funny, but the person it would then take the previous 6 pages on would only see the last paragraph, and they'd have to then reconstruct and make the story go in a direction only from reading the last paragraph. And we took this exercise, which was very funny in places and ridiculous in others, and I sent it through my grandfather, as it turned out, to Spike, who was being detained for his own safety. I sent a copy of this to him. Basically what happened was, about 6 weeks later, I got in the post a envelope, and in that envelope there was a sort of A5 small piece of blue lined notepaper, which Spike had written a note in yellow crayon on. It was obviously the sharpest thing they would allow him to have at the time.
I see, yeah.
And it simply said, "Dear Simon," and I thought I was mad, "love, Spike."
Oh, there you go. What an endorsement.
What an endorsement, but also somebody who, even at the darkest point, would find the most brilliant humour in it. And I think one of the things that I would say that we said earlier on is we drag ourselves down the road of hell by thinking that that depression is unique to us individually in life, and the reality of it is that we need to kind of embrace certain sides of that and understand that you can be quite productive and creative through that, and that the silver lining is that you can do that, and it's a part of solving the crisis that is depression, is to kind of go through these things. So it's really important that people do try and do that. And I think the other thing I would say to people, which I do, is walk as much as you can, if you're able to, because walking does actually change your mind. The further you can walk, the more you can walk, and people talk about their 10,000 steps, but the reality is if you can get out and have a good walk, you may not come back feeling fantastic, but you will feel better than when you went out. And just remembering that music is there for you and comedy is there for you, and that actually asking for help and being around other people, because you'd be surprised to find how many people are like you.
All right. I've got a few things just to clear up before we finish here. There were things that I wanted to get into, but I think we've...
Was it my invoice?
Oh, yes. That involves some zeros. You can work the rest out. But like you said, music, yes. Comedy, yes. I mean, I would say, if you're in England, I don't know, Alan Partridge, Blackadder, Fawlty Towers. I mean, Fawlty Towers, it's just timeless. You know, there's a reason why John Cleese and Connie Booth spent weeks on each script to get it perfect. Exercise, as you said, I remember reading in some book, I can't remember which one, running up a hill and then down the other side is not only good exercise, but it's a wonderful metaphor for life, in that you do the hard work to get to the top, and then you will get some reward, which is you get to, sprint down the other side of the hill. I'm a massive proponent of meditation. I think I was saying to you, I think it was off mic, meditation or medication, there's only one letter difference, but there's a huge... some people would fall into one camp, one would fall into the other. But yeah, meditation, if you've never tried it, if the word scares you, then call it mindfulness, which is a less loaded term. And then, again, it seems like an old cliche, but thinking about people that are far worse off than yourself, which is circling back to what we said right at the beginning when I was saying you were talking about Ukraine, and I was saying I was in the park and someone went by in a wheelchair who looked about 25 years old. Coping mechanisms, journaling is one, as they call it in America. Diary writing, we might call it in England. I mean, I like writing anyway, but I don't think you have to be a writer to get a lot out of that. Just putting it down on paper has a psychological effect. And then, I won't go into this now, but a thing called Cognitive Behavioural Therapy, CBT, which is really the difference between that and what you'd probably find in a Woody Allen film when he's lying on a settee talking about his childhood. This is much more scientific, and it's looking at what's in the moment, not what happened to you when you were a child, but what you're actually feeling now. And it seeks to connect thoughts, emotions, bodily sensations and behaviour. That's definitely worth looking into. And, I think this has been an uplifting conversation about depression, which was my intention. And if anyone would like to write to me at the usual address, lifeandlifeonlypod@gmail.com, if you would like any other things we could recommend, or, there's millions of resources, almost literally millions now out there. And I want to say thank you to you for doing this. I think it's been great. Could you give us where listeners could find you, and just mention one more time your Beatles project?
Well, they can find me if they walk about for long enough in Luton.
Okay, just walk the streets of Luton.
Walk the streets of Luton, you will find me. And if you do find me, tell me where I live and return me home. I would say that, not that it's hugely important, but if you are a Beatles fan and you love the Beatles, then if you go to Beatles Doc, which is, as in documentary, BeatlesDoc.com, you will find out a little bit more about what we're doing. And one of the things that's really interesting about that is that we have had stories of people talking about how the Beatles have got them through really difficult times in their lives, and how the power of that musical canon that is the Beatles has got them through everything. Yeah. So, if somebody wants to come and tell us a story about how they've conquered anxiety and depression by the Beatles, then head to BeatlesDoc.com and you will have some friends there who will be very happy to listen to your story as well.
Fantastic. I'm actually about to teach a lady in Brazil who found me through one of the podcasts and wants an English course centred on Beatles. Not all Beatles, but, well, she'll find out. Probably will be all Beatles, but...
You should record that or put it in the film.
Yeah. They haven't actually started yet. She's trying to get a company to pay for it, that could be a long, drawn-out process, but I'm hoping...
Well, when you do, let me know, because that's the kind of thing we're doing. That's the kind of stories that we thrive on.
I mean, it is a fantastic thing, that in America you can study the Beatles, can't you? And, of course, if you're a teacher, you can
you can
teach.
hear now. Yeah,
you can hear, really?
Yeah.
Oh, if they're looking for teachers. If anyone's listening...
there's a course in Liverpool.
If anyone's listening, I'm available.
Available for weddings, bar mitzvahs and Beatles courses.
Weddings, bar mitzvahs. I was going to say funerals, but no, I don't want to say that.
Funerals and Beatles parties.
Beatles parties, yeah.
Beatles courses.
And just before we go, just a quick note to the audience. Thank you very much for listening. Please leave ratings, reviews, all that good stuff. Feedback, lifeandlifeonlypod@gmail.com. buymeacoffee.com/Anthony Ratuna if you want to help the show out. And I'm also a life coach. So if anyone is interested in life coaching, I tackle mental health issues, again, up to a point, because I'm not a qualified therapist. I'm a life coach, and there's a bit of a grey area there, but certainly CBT is something that I've become quite well versed in. But yeah, other than that, just give us some feedback. We'd love to hear what you thought about the show, and Simon, once again, thanks a lot for being on.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on, and hope we have extolled some nuggets to people that will benefit from our strengths and weaknesses, let's say.
That's it. We're just human, aren't we? Being human, yes.
Being human is okay.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye. Give us a goodbye.
Oh, goodbye, and take care. Be happy, be well.
Same from me.